In 1600, a pound of nutmeg in Amsterdam sold for roughly the same price as several months of a laborer's wages. That same pound was purchased in the Banda Islands for a fraction of a percent of that price, a markup from cost to final sale price that contemporary accounts put as high as 32,000%. People paid it anyway, every time, because they believed they needed what nutmeg did. In the medical understanding of 1600, nutmeg had real uses. The Galenic tradition, the system of medicine derived from ancient Greek theory that still dominated European thought, held that the human body was governed by four humors, and that spices operated as correctives when those humors fell out of balance. Nutmeg specifically was prescribed for digestive disorders, liver complaints, headaches. It was used as a topical treatment, rubbed into the skin. Ground into wine, it was believed to have stimulant effects.
Which, in some cases, it actually does. Nutmeg contains myristicin, which has mild psychoactive properties in large doses. The medical claims weren't all invented. Some of them landed on something real.
But the claim that resonated deepest in the century of plague was the prophylactic one. The belief that nutmeg, worn in a small pomander around the neck or taken internally, could protect against the Black Death. There is no medical mechanism that supports this, but in a period when nobody understood how plague spread, nutmeg at least gave people something to do. The association of nutmeg with plague protection reached the highest levels. European royalty reportedly carried nutmeg in pomanders. Physicians wore beak-shaped masks stuffed with spices, nutmeg among them. The demand was not irrational given what people believed. It was the demand of frightened people paying whatever it cost for protection.
And that's still true today, because every pharmaceutical product that addresses fear, statins, supplements, anything people take against a risk they can't see or control, commands a premium that has almost nothing to do with production cost and everything to do with what people are willing to pay to feel safe. Nutmeg was a psychological product, dressed as a medicinal one. The Banda Islands were producing safety.
The Banda Islands. 10 volcanic islands scattered in the Banda Sea in what is now eastern Indonesia. The largest, Banda Besar, perhaps 12 kilometers long. The volcanic soil there produces exactly the conditions that the nutmeg tree, Myristica fragrans, requires: mineral-rich, well-drained, consistently warm, humid. The tree was not transplanted to these islands, it evolved there. And because the conditions were so specific, it grew there and essentially nowhere else, which meant the entire global supply of nutmeg existed within a chain of islands you could sail across in a day. Every pomander in London, every prescription from every European physician, every wealthy household that used nutmeg to demonstrate status at the table, all of it came from 10 islands that most Europeans couldn't name. The Bandanese who lived on those islands had understood the commercial implication of their geography long before the Dutch arrived. The Arab and Javanese traders who had worked the Banda Sea for centuries had built a system of exchange around that geography, and the Bandanese had shaped that system deliberately. You did not come to the Banda Islands as a conqueror and walk away with nutmeg. You came as a buyer, you negotiated, and you paid a price that the Bandanese considered fair.
The orang kaya, that's the term. It means, roughly, the wealthy ones, the men of standing. They were the merchant leaders of the Bandanese communities, not kings in the European sense, something closer to a council of prosperous men whose authority derived from commercial success and community standing.
What the Orang Kaya had built over generations was a multi-buyer system. Arab merchants, Javanese merchants, Chinese merchants, eventually Portuguese merchants. They all competed for Bandanese nutmeg.
That competition kept prices favorable to the Bandanese and kept no single foreign power in a position to dictate terms. The Portuguese arrived in the early 16th century, made the usual European attempts to establish exclusive trading rights, were refused, and eventually had to accept the same terms as everyone else.
The Bandanese commercial strategy was, by any modern definition, sophisticated price discrimination. They understood that their supply was fixed, that demand was global and growing, and that the only threat to their position was a buyer who could eliminate the competition. So they made sure there was always competition, always an alternative buyer, always another ship in the harbor.
That multi-buyer system wasn't new, and it wasn't unique to the Bandanese. From roughly the 7th century, Arab traders had dominated the spice routes running from South Arabia across the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf into Egypt, then on to the Mediterranean. A network so effective that buyers in Cairo and Damascus and eventually Venice paid whatever price Arab and Rothanite Jewish intermediaries set for close to 1,000 years, without most of them ever learning where the spices actually originated. For most of European history, nobody in Venice or London had any idea nutmeg grew on 10 specific volcanic islands in the Banda Sea. The source was a trade secret, enforced by distance and by every merchant along the chain having an interest in keeping it that way. Vasco da Gama's voyage around the Cape of Good Hope in 1498 to break that chain, not by discovering a new spice, but by finding a sea route to the source and cutting out 1,000 years of Arab and Venetian middlemen. The Portuguese didn't create European demand for nutmeg, they just stopped paying somebody else's markup.
Every generation in this trade was chasing the same thing: get one layer closer to the source and eliminate whoever stood between you and it. The Bandanese had held off centuries of that pressure by refusing to let anyone get all the way to the front of the line. The Dutch, arriving next, were the first buyer with both the motive and the means to remove the line entirely.
The Dutch arrived in the Banda Islands in 1599 on the second Dutch expedition east, and they encountered exactly this system. The Bandanese were willing to trade. They were not willing to sign exclusive contracts. The distinction, from the Bandanese perspective, was the difference between commerce and surrender. And from the VOC's perspective, those two things were identical. An exclusive contract was the entire logic of the VOC structure. You did not build a joint stock company, get a monopoly charter from the States General, equip an army and a navy to end up as one buyer among several. The charter demanded exclusivity. The Bandanese refused it. There was no version of this story where that tension resolves peacefully.
The VOC's approach to Banda started with treaties, not violence. In 1602, the Dutch secured their first alliance with some of the Orientcaya, winning first right to buy nutmeg. By 1605, they'd gotten nearly every community on the islands to sign a similar agreement. Every community except one. Lontor held out. 14 of 15 villages, and the 15th was still enough to keep the whole system from closing.
And already, in 1607, 2 years before anyone died, a VOC official named Cornelius Mateliff proposed a solution to that problem. Hire foreign mercenaries, conquer the islands outright, replace the Orientcaya with outsiders, and forcibly relocate the entire population into a single, controllable settlement. The plan was never carried out, but someone inside the company had already worked out, on paper, that removing the Bandanese from the equation was a viable option, 14 years before Coen made it real. The order that sent Admiral Verhoef to Banda in 1609 told him to bind the islands to the company.
The original Dutch phrase was by treaty or by force. Both were written into the same instruction, 6 years before the Heeren XVII would write nearly identical language to Coen. Verhoef arrived with a large, well-armed fleet and read the Orankaya a letter proposing a formal alliance, one that included a Dutch fort on their own island. They stalled. By the 25th of April, Verhoef's patience ran out. He ordered his men ashore to start building the fort without waiting for an answer. Only after that did the Bandanese invite him to come negotiate. When Verhoef arrived at the meeting place, it was an ambush. He and his companions were surrounded and killed. More than 30 Dutchmen died with him. The fleet retaliated along the coast for months afterward, burning ships and reducing settlements to rubble until a new treaty was signed in August. The fort the VOC finished building was named Fort Nassau. The VOC now considered its harbor its property.
You can watch the logic of escalation in the documents from here forward. Each incident becomes justification for greater force, which produces a new incident, which justifies more force still. The VOC didn't need to want extermination from the beginning. The structure produced it incrementally, and by 1609, it had already produced a written order authorizing exactly the choice Coen would be handed again, in writing 6 years later.
Jan Pieterszoon Coen arrived in the region in 1607, initially as a junior merchant, sailing east with the same fleet under the same Admiral Verhoef that would end in the killing 2 years later. Coen didn't hear about Verhoef's death in a report forwarded back to Amsterdam. He was on that voyage. He was there. And that changes what the 1609 killing meant for him specifically. For the Heeren XVII back in Amsterdam, Verhoef was a name in a file, a grievance to be leveraged. For Coen, it was something he'd watched happen to men he'd sailed with. His letters to the Heeren XVII over the following decade constitute one of the most extraordinary records in commercial history, not because of what they conceal, but because of what they say plainly. Coen wrote to his employers in the language of a man who had calculated what was necessary and was asking permission to do it.
The precision is the thing. He wasn't raving. He wasn't making passionate speeches about Dutch glory. He was writing like a project manager who had identified a bottleneck and was requesting authorization to clear it.
In 1614, Coen wrote to the Heeren XVII, the letter is in the VOC archive in The Hague, the following: "There is nothing in the world that gives one a better right than power and force added to right." He was 27 years old at the time he wrote that, 7 years into working through the logic of Banda, ever since he watched Verhoef die. This was a considered position, not a young man's outburst.
And the Heeren XVII read it, and they promoted him. Not that Coen believed it. One man's moral framework, however ugly, is one man's. What matters is that the men in Amsterdam, sitting with their dividend expectations and their shareholder certificates, read that letter and decided this was the person they wanted running their Asian operations.
The Heeren XVII appointed Coen Governor-General of the Dutch East Indies in 1618. He was 31 years old. His headquarters were in Batavia, the city the Dutch had built on the site of the Javanese town of Jayakarta on the northwest coast of Java, now Jakarta. From Batavia, he had the authority and the instrument to do what he believed the numbers required.
The accounting of what Coen cleared away keeps getting reduced to numbers. But the Banda Islands before 1621 were a functioning society, Muslim, literate, globally connected. The Orankaya weren't chieftains presiding over a village economy. They were merchants who had been negotiating with Arab, Javanese, and Portuguese traders for generations.
The Banda Islands, before the VOC's campaign, held a population estimated at around 15,000 people. The Orang Kaya governed through a system of consensus. There was no single ruler the Dutch could negotiate with or threaten or bribe. The authority was distributed, which was part of why exclusive contracts were so structurally difficult. Even an Orang Kaya who wanted to sign one couldn't deliver compliance from the other Orang Kaya. The Dutch had built their entire commercial architecture around a single point of control. One contract, one authority, one counterparty. And they arrived at the Banda Islands, and there is no single point of control. The thing they need most, geographically, is organized in exactly the way that makes their model impossible to impose. The refusal to grant exclusive contracts came from a precise understanding of what those contracts would cost. The Orang Kaya knew exactly what they were being asked to give up, and the history of that refusal keeps getting written as a kind of tragic innocence. These islanders who didn't realize what was coming. But the Orang Kaya knew exactly what was coming. They were trying to prevent it using the only tools available to them, which were commercial leverage and the hope that geography would limit what the Dutch could commit to. Geography did not limit it. What Coen understood, and what made him different from the VOC commanders who had preceded him, was that the Banda Islands could not simply be pressured into compliance. The multi-buyer system would reconstitute itself as long as the Bandanese had the standing to sell to anyone who arrived. To destroy the multi-buyer system required destroying the Bandanese capacity to exercise that standing.
The modern version of this is vertical integration taken to its terminal conclusion. You eliminate the supplier's negotiating power, not by outcompeting the other buyers, but by eliminating the supplier's ability to have other buyers at all. Standard corporate strategy, except the mechanism was not acquisition, it was annihilation.
3 years before that promotion, in 1615, the Heeren XVII had already sent Coen written instructions for the Banda Islands. The letter survives in the archive in The Hague. It told him to secure the islands, and it named 2 acceptable methods for doing it: exterminate the leadership or expel it. Either was authorized. The company would repopulate the islands afterward with people of its own choosing.
Read that again. That's not a commander exceeding his orders and getting forgiven for it after the fact. That's the board, in writing, 6 years before anything happened, naming extermination as one of 2 acceptable outcomes and leaving the choice between them to the man on the ground.
6 years after that letter, Coen sailed for Banda with a fleet and a ground force of Dutch soldiers and Japanese mercenaries. What he did when he got there is where this goes next. In 1621, Jan Petersen Coen arrived in the Banda Islands to execute an order the Heeren XVII had put in writing 6 years earlier. What happened next is documented, filed, and archived in more detail than almost any atrocity of its century, because the men who authorized it never imagined they would need to hide it.
This is Pulse. Origins. Produced by Singularity Pulse Network. Views expressed are our own. New episodes every Sunday. Follow us on @ThePulseSPN on X, the Everything app.
I'm Knox. Every Saturday on Pulse Deep Dive, one story told in acts. This season, how AI happened, who really invented the internet, and going back to the moon 53 years later. New chapter every Saturday. Find it wherever you listen.